Hey guys, what is up? SuperKmanrocks here, and we are here for my LCS Week 4 overview, analysis, and of course, at the end, my updated power rankings. I'm incredibly excited for this video because it's not a regular LCS week. We are in a super week, which means that it's not the regular 10 games across 2 days. We now have 15 games to cover across 3 days. Those of you who watch the LEC this split will know this format well, or at least will know this structure well. 15 games across 3 days is a lot to cover, so I don't want to waste too much time. Just a little bit of an aside, if you can hear my voice a little nasally or a little bit hoarse, I am still sick. You know, obviously I talked about that in the LPL and the LCK videos earlier this week, but I am still a little bit sick. I feel obviously good enough to make these videos, but I apologize if my voice does sound a tad bit different. The analysis should be fine, but without further ado, let's go ahead and jump into it. If you are new here, what we're going to be doing is going through all 15 games in the LCS this week, talking about who I think played well, who I think did not play well, where teams are headed, where teams are not headed, you know, trying to manage expectations, narratives, all that kinds of stuff. So, without further ado, let's go ahead and jump into day number 1. And we kicked off day 1 with a matchup I was really interested in seeing, especially right now with how both teams are playing. We had Evil Geniuses taking on 100 Thieves, and this was a fiesta. There is literally no other way to put it. This was a disaster of a game that EG was very lucky to walk out with a win, and it was a really weird draft, I would say, from both teams, both kind of indexing very hard in one particular direction. You look at EG's draft and you're like, okay, Caitlyn Lux, you've got the Renekton, you've got the Sylas, like, you're really going to get outscaled in this game, but if you can generate a large enough lead early, you should be able to kind of just win from that point onwards. And then for 100 Thieves, you really have no early pressure. You have Jinx going into Caitlyn, which is not really going to work even with the Karma. You've got Azir going into Sylas. Sylas is going to have Shove in that lane, and he's going to be able to roam a lot more frequently. And then you've got the Gragas into Renekton top lane, where you're just not going to be able to play super aggro in the early game. And so you don't really have a lot of ways to generate your own lead in this game, and you're really relying on EG messing up. And this is more of a, what I like to call a do nothing and win comp, right? Where you kind of just want to scale up into the late game and hope that the enemy team makes some mistakes. I'm not particularly fond of these comps, but overall, this game actually went really even for most of the game. EG was able to generate a lot of leads through really good macro pressure in the early game. Big credit to Jojo, Pune, and Inspired. They, I think, paired up really nicely for taking advantage of some of the 100 Thieves mistakes. And, you know, I'm not going to call, like, Double Lift and Busio running under Tier 2 tower a mistake, right? Because at some point you just have to accept that you're going to die, and that's going to happen. But Closer not really being in the right spot at any point in time, Bjergsen being super passive in the early game. These are some mistakes that I do want to point out for 100 Thieves that got them into their hole. But eventually the game slowed down, and it really slowed down. The pace was excruciatingly low, and 100 Thieves ends up getting back into the game purely from the fact of, look at this comp, you've got Gragas, you've got Azir, you've got Jinx. Like, they're going to be able to win every team fight if you start hitting 3, 4, 5 items on your carries, and that's exactly what happened. Unfortunately, what they didn't predict is that they would make a horrendously bad call, and they would trade Baron for Nexus, and that's exactly what happened. They go for Baron, they try to sneak it as 5-man, try to force Evil Geniuses to do something, and do something they did. They took the game, and I don't really know how to analyze that. That's a mistake that I just don't think top teams are going to make all that frequently, but, you know, 100 Thieves has shown their problems, and they had a chance to win this game, and they couldn't get it done. As for Evil Geniuses, yes, you're walking out of this with a win, and it's a good win over a team like 100 Thieves. You're going to be really happy that you're walking away with, you know, at least some level of elo here, if you will, but it wasn't a particularly clean game. You probably should have lost it after you played so safe, so boring, so passive for basically the entire mid to end game, that really there was not a lot of opportunity for you to really push your advantages, and just with how you were playing. My player of the game is going to go to Inspired, because I think if there was a player in the game that was at least going out there and trying to make plays, especially in the early to mid game, it was Inspired. He was setting up a lot of plays for EG. Big credit to Jojo Pune as well, who was trying to make plays on that Sylas. Obviously a ton of roam spot, a ton of pressure just going with Inspired and trying to make plays across the map out of the lane. But outside of that, I really don't think anybody on EG really was, like, awesome. FBI and Vulcan did a really good job pressing their advantage early because they were given a lot of resources from the rest of their team. But at the end of the day, they basically did nothing when the game got further along. I understand Caitlyn Lux isn't exactly great in the mid game, but they are incredibly strong in the late game when Caitlyn starts to get that 3rd or 4th item on her. And FBI really wasn't doing all that much damage. Someday really fell off hard, I would say, in this game. It was really up to Inspired and Jojo to make some of these aggressive plays and to make them work out. Luckily for EG, they were able to do that, but it's not exactly the cleanest win of all time for this Evil Geniuses squad. As for 100 Thieves, frustrating. Like, I know I use that word a lot on this channel, but I would be so incredibly frustrated if I lost this game. Not only because you made a call that was, a loss, right? Like, you made a call that directly contributed to you losing the game, but even outside of that, you were in such a good position in this game by basically doing nothing, and that's not the way you want to play the game. Like, even looking at this, if they were to have won the game, I feel like they wouldn't be walking away with a particularly positive mentality from it if it was me, if I was in the coaching staff. My dud of the game, couple of options here for 100 Thieves. I'm going to give it to Bjergsen in the mid lane. I'm someone who pushes back pretty heavily on this narrative that Bjergsen is kind of a do-nothing, win-the-game kind of player. I don't think that was the case last year on Team Liquid. I certainly think there were moments where he was like that, but I think the moments where he was proactive and the moments where he had really strong mid-games were definitely outweighing the times where he didn't, and I think the narrative just kind of took over from there, but this was one of those games where it very much felt like, oh, JoJo's out on the map, making plays, going bot lane, trying to dive, right? Like, and Bjergsen's just farming mid. And I get it, you're Azir, you want to hit that power spike in the late game, and ironically enough, it actually worked. You got to the point on Azir where you really were much stronger than the enemy team because you just sat mid and farmed it up. But Evil Geniuses probably should have never let you be in that spot in the first place, and so Bjerg's going to get my dud of the series. I think you could very realistically give this to Closer, who just was in the wrong spot a lot of the early game. He didn't have a particularly strong early game, in my opinion. You had to know that Doublelift and Busia were going to be super targeted in this lane because you don't want to get that Jinx online. You want to make sure the Karma pick gets punished early by another poke lane here in the Caitlyn Lux, and Closer just didn't do a particularly good job of managing that, in my opinion. So those two players, in my opinion, were definitely the big difference makers. I would say jungle mid was definitely in favor of EG, and that's really what swung this game in favor of Evil Geniuses in the first place. But it's not like FBI and Vulcan played bad. It's not like Doublelift and Busio played great. That was just kind of how it ended up working out. Overall, for 100 Thieves, I still think that they are a good team. I'm not exactly sure how good. This was a pretty poor showing in terms of macro. Not only did I hate the draft, but I hated how you played it out. I guess you played it right, but you ended up throwing that away at the end. It's just not a particularly inspiring performance, and hopefully you're going to be able to bounce back with something better as the week goes on. And then for Evil Geniuses, I mean, at least you won the game, but it's not a particularly good win. Good for Inspire, good for JoJo to at least show that they want to make some proactive plays in the early game, but where did that go in the mid to late game? That's something that has to keep up basically through the entire game for you to feel comfortable. That's something they have been very good at over the past year. I'm going to take this as a little bit more of an outlier. I want to see a little bit more aggression coming out from Evil Geniuses. Luckily, with the players on this team, I don't think that's going to be a problem that we have to wait on for long. Moving on now to our second series of day number one, or second game, I should say, of day number one. We had a fun matchup, top team versus a bottom team, always at least a little bit interesting. We had Immortals taking on FlyQuest, and FlyQuest does get the job done. They are able to maintain their undefeated record and keep the 18-0 dream alive, at least through day number one here, and they just look untouchable. Like, legitimately, they look untouchable at the LCS level, especially going into a team like Immortals. This was not particularly close. You're looking at the two team comps here, and you're looking at a very early game comp versus a very late game comp. Azir, Maokai, Xayah taking on Renekton, Lucian, Nami, right? Like, Immortals has to generate an early lead, and even then, they lost every single lane, and it's ridiculous. Like, I don't know what to tell you. FlyQuest is just simply too good, and it's all the players, but it's how they play together that really works it and makes it as, frustrating to deal with as I think it is for a lot of the enemy teams. So, who's player of the game? I think there's a couple options for this, but I'm going to give it to Prince in the bot lane. Obviously, you don't need me to tell you how good Prince is. You don't need me to tell you that Prince is the most talented and the best player in the LCS right now. He has just proven it basically every single game. He pulls out the Xayah here, plays it with Winsome's Rakan. He's able to generate a really big lead against Tactical in the bot lane. And just the damage that he's able to put out in a lot of these late game team fights. I think he did like 5k damage in the last team fight of the game. It's just absurd, right? It's something that other players in the league just can't do. They can't play like he can play. They can't position, they can't deal damage, they can't play safe. They can't win lane. It's just, he does things that nobody else in the league is doing, and it makes him basically impossible to have to beat. I think him and Winsome play well together, although Winsome has certainly had his hiccups. I still think that the, interesting thing between Ayla and Winsome is there. Like, I think you could make the call either way, and I wouldn't be particularly upset either way. I think Ayla is the better player, and so I would probably say I would play Ayla, but Winsome has played super well with Instructure. Obviously, he can speak Korean, and so I'm sure it helps Prince and Vikla kind of feel a little bit more at ease at home on the team, and so I can't imagine that you could go wrong either way, but Prince and Winsome for now are working really well together, but Prince is just on a different level. I imagine he can make basically any support in the entire league look like one of the best with the way that he's playing right now. Big shout out to Vikla. He played really well on the Azir. The damage he was doing in the late game was incredibly high. When we get to these front-to-back team fights, it's very difficult to deal with the Azir if the Akali is not actively ahead or if the Renekton is not actively ahead, and of course neither were in this game, and so Vikla had a lot of free reign to basically do whatever he wanted. And then I really want to talk about Spica. I know the narrative around Spica right now has basically just been, oh, you know, Vikla, Prince, really, really good. Spica's just benefiting off of that. Spica's been the best jungler in the league, and it hasn't been particularly close. His early game pathing is second to none right now in the LCS. He always knows exactly where he needs to be. He's exactly in the position that helps his team the most. The thing I always talk about on this channel, jungle pressure. No one in the league has done that better than Spica. I know we can look at Vikla and Prince and say, like, oh, Spica's getting carried, you know, Winsome's getting carried, Impact's getting carried, but Spica has delivered to this team just as much as anybody else here. Obviously, the Amumu games really stand out, but go watch this Maokai game. He is controlling the map. He is making it so difficult for Immortals to actually play out any sort of advantage that they want to try and generate in this game, and that's insane for a jungler like Maokai to go into Sejuani and just have so much pressure. I mean, controlling the map so heavily. Credit to Prince, credit to Vikla, credit to Impact. They're all winning lane, and they're all doing a good job, but Spica is, I think, someone who is kind of flying under the radar in terms of how well he is playing, and definitely deserves to be kind of talked about in that same discussion. But overall, I think FlyQuest is obviously fantastic. You really don't need me to tell you that, though, right? As for Immortals on the other side, this isn't particularly surprising. This team has outdone a bit of the expectations to start the year. 2 wins is not where I thought they would be after the first, couple of weeks, but here we are, going up against FlyQuest. I'm not particularly surprised to see them not just be able to be in the game. I think there were a couple players you could give dud of the game to. For me, it's going to go to Tactical in the bot lane. You talk about the Gale Force RFC build on Lucian. I know it's a very hotly contested topic that why would you build that into Maokai Cassante? You're literally never going to break through them, and while I agree with that, I do understand that Tactical just kind of wants the early power spike as much as possible, and I think both of those items kind of give you a little bit of an early power spike. It doesn't really matter, though. Tactical's positioning was awful. He wasn't able to win lane. Him and Fleshy didn't particularly work together well in this game. It felt like they were kind of off in terms of the decisions they wanted to make in the 2v2 in the bot lane, but they were far from the only players playing bad. Revenge blind picks Renekton and just gets countered with the Cassante and can't do anything in this game. Blaze Olive is not nearly on the same level as a player like Vikla, and his inability to get any sort of gold on the Akali really costs Immortals any chance at playing in the mid game right now. And then Kenvi, for his credit, had some moments where he was at least making plays on the map, but for the most part, this Immortals team was just outclassed and outskilled, and that was expected to happen. Really, it's not a particularly big surprise. I think overall for Immortals, you're looking at this game and you're like, okay, well, we lost to FlyQuest. It is what it is. We're not gonna pull the plug on anything just yet, but at the same time, you're like, maybe we can still, push for like 7th, 8th. I think that's a real possibility for this team. Not exactly sure if they, particularly fall into that category right now, but this loss definitely solidifies them as not a top 6 team. And then for FlyQuest, you're number 1. I mean, what do you want me to say? You're 7-0, undefeated. You have the best player, maybe some of the best players, like 3 of the top 5 best players in the league right now in Prince, Vikla, and Spica. Impact and Winsome are certainly no slouches, but FlyQuest just feels untouchable when they play at their own level. Obviously, I'm really interested to see what's going to happen with this team once they actually start to get tested, because it feels like basically every game they've played in has been a little bit of a blowout, maybe with the exception of the Evil Geniuses game, but it's just insane how much further ahead they are than basically anybody else in the league. Jumping into the third game here of day number 1, we had another interesting matchup. 2 teams that have kind of been on the downswing recently, both trying to get back into the form that I think they both want to have. We had Counter Logic Gaming taking on Team Liquid, and CLG picks up a really big win here. They had really been struggling over the past few weeks. Obviously, 0-4 in the last 4 games is not exactly what you wanted to have happen after going 2-0 to start the year, but a game against TL, that's the right way to get right back on track. And, say what you want about CLG, say what you want about their losing streak and about how, sometimes they just play a little bit too over-aggressive, but they are fun to watch, and these comps are the exact reason why. Aurelia top, Kalista, Annie bot, Akali in the mid lane. This is what I want to see. This is fun League of Legends, and CLG, to their credit, is pretty much always going to try and play fun League of Legends. This Aurelia completely took over this game, especially towards the back half. Dokla, a very easy choice for player of the game for me. A really, really fun performance from him. It's always good to see Big Dokes get something that he can play really aggressively and really, I don't know, a lot more forward, I would say, in lane, and be able to just kind of punish the enemy laner on it. I feel like that's what Dokla has always specialized in, is early aggression and playing really, really to win the game and not just to scale. That's what I like to see out of Dokla. That's what I like to see out of CLG in general. They did that a lot last year, or at least, towards the middle part of last year. They were really playing a lot of aggressive stuff on the top side and really trying to get Dokla ahead, and that's exactly what happened in this game. Really good game from him on the Aurelia. I would say Dokla overall has been about to expectation. I really like Dokla as a player. I think he's a, mid to upper tier LCS top laner, which is a very good thing for CLG. He's probably the most talented player on this team. I think obviously him and Luger are definitely going to go back and forth on that, and we'll talk about Luger. He also had a phenomenal game here, but Dokla is just really, really fun to watch. I think ever since he joined the team in summer of last year, this team has just felt an uptick in aggression, an uptick in fun, and I think Dokla is a big cause for that. I really, really like him as a player, and he's definitely one of the players to keep an eye on for CLG. The other one that I always talk about, and honestly, at this point, I understand if you are a fan of this channel and you get tired of hearing me hype him up, but Luger. Luger is so freaking good in the bot lane. I feel like he is so underrated as a player in the LCS, a consistent top 3 or 4 AD carry in the LCS since he joined. He has been very, very fun to watch. Him and Poom just did a great job going into Yon and really making him struggle on the Ashe. Credit to Core. I thought Core played really well and kept Yon at a relatively reasonable distance, but Luger and Poom were so much better than them, and just kind of scaling into that mid game, the Kalista power spike that you get early on, but then again, around like an item and a half or so, was just so strong, and Luger was doing so much damage. You combine the Aurelia and the Kalista, and then you've got an Annie, you've got a Vi to get onto the backline, you've got a Kali jumping in back there as well. It's very difficult for this TL comp to actually play from behind, and luckily for CLG, they were able to generate a pretty strong early game lead. And so overall for CLG, just a really, really good showing, a really good performance. TL is really struggling and kind of give you an opportunity to kind of prove that you can kind of get back on track here, as I would say, get back on track from the 0-4. This is exactly what you needed, was a really strong win like this against a team that isn't like a complete pushover. As for TL on the other side, you definitely got to feel frustrated by the loss here. You're really starting to get concerned because some of these players are really just not playing up to expectations. Really, it's the top side of the map that has really been bad. Summit and Pioshik have not been good for TL. I would argue that they have pretty consistently been the worst players on TL. Harry has had some moments. I thought he was okay in this game. Certainly wasn't game-defining, but wasn't a huge problem for them either. Core was really good. Yon didn't have a particularly good game, but he has been a big focal point for TL up until this point in the season. But Summit and Pioshik have just not been good. Summit will have some really good plays where he'll be able to generate really strong leads, but he will almost immediately throw them away multiple times throughout a game. That's why he's going to get done to the game here. I understand the feast or famine mentality, and I do like the idea of, players taking risks and trying to maintain, aggressive plays and trying to generate leads. But the problem is, I want you to take 60-40s. I want you to take 65-35s or 70-30s, right? Those are the plays that we want you to take that, maybe back in 2015 teams just wouldn't have taken. But I don't want you to take 40-60s, right? I don't want you to take plays that are actively just dumb, actively bad plays. We talked about this with Rascal on DRX in the LCK video that came out yesterday, but sometimes as a top laner, you have to understand when it is your time to play safe, when it is your time to play weak side, and it just feels like Summit doesn't have that down. He will make some crazy plays, and sometimes they'll work, but oftentimes they just have not worked over the course of the year, and I feel like he has been more of a negative for TL than he has been a positive. Pioshik has been nothing in the jungle. If anything, he has been a hindrance because he just doesn't have any objective control. We obviously all know that was a problem for him in the LCK and obviously at Worlds, but it has been even more of a problem in the LCS here. Obviously, Contracts stealing the Baron that TL was going for, that really sealed the game for them, but Pioshik looks incredibly tilted. He's the kind of player who has historically not played well when the rest of his team is not doing well. Think back to like 2021 DRX when they had that full rookie lineup and Pioshik really started struggling, looked like one of the worst junglers in the entire league when the rest of his team wasn't playing well. That's the Pioshik that you have. He's very feast or famine in that same way that Summit is very feast or famine. He's one of those players that when he is on is going to look good, but when he is off, like he looked, multiple times throughout the LCK last year in summer, it's just not going to go well. And so TL's really struggling right now. That top side just needs to step it up. That's really the only thing that I can say. Harry, Yon, Core, they can play this way and still win games if Summit and Pioshik are at least serviceable on the top side. But right now, quite frankly, they just have not been serviceable on the top side. They've been some of the worst players in their position in the entirety of the LCS. And so TL definitely has a lot of room to upgrade, a lot of things that they need to work out. But right now, I'm really starting to get concerned about TL and if they're even a top 6 team at all. As for CLG, like I said, Really good to get back on track here. Really good to get your confidence back after some really tough weeks. Hopefully you can carry this over. I know TL isn't exactly the biggest win right now, but what CLG needed was a win. A lot of times CLG works very similarly to how DRX worked in the LCK last year, where it very much feels like a week-to-week basis which CLG team you're going to get, because the aggressive plays sometimes work and they sometimes don't. This was a good showing that hopefully in this Super Week they're coming out with a lot of fire, a lot of aggression, and they're going to be able to push their advantages. Dokla and Luger really are fantastic, and CLG, I have them down at number 9 because they really have been struggling recently in the power rankings, but this is a team that could really easily make their way back into top 6 if they just keep playing like this. Moving on now to our 4th game of day, number 1. And it was another one that I guess I'll just kind of briefly touch over because it really wasn't all that surprising, and it really was never supposed to be close. We had Dignitas taking on Cloud9, and Cloud9 does pick up the win, as they absolutely should. Obviously, not the best couple of weeks for Cloud9, losing to FlyQuest, losing to Evil Geniuses. A little bit of a rough go of it, I would say, recently for C9, but playing Dignitas gets you right back on track. There is no team that's going to get you more back on track than a team like Dig right now. I think their game plan was solid. They really wanted to play through their bot lane and just get them super far ahead. Dignitas wanted to do the opposite, really wanted to play through topside, especially with that Elise Jace early on. You saw Santorin going to the top side a ton during the early game, trying to get a ton of gold onto that Jace, while C9 basically just said, well, that's fine. We have the much better bot lane. We're going to demolish the 2v2. We're going to get this Lucian Nami into a really prime position, and then the mid game is just going to destroy for us. We're going to be able to take every objective. We're going to be able to take every skirmish. And that's exactly what happened in this game. Credit to Berserker, credit to Sven. They obliterated this bot lane 2v2. Berserker's player of the game, not particularly surprising. He has been great this year. He's really stepped up and proven that he deserves to be considered one of the best AD carries, one of the best players in the LCS. We all thought it going into the year, but it's really good to see him be able to do it a second year in a row, because a lot of players sometimes don't have the follow-up in them. Berserker absolutely does here. He has been great in lane and out of lane as a carry for this team. As good as Fudge has been, I think Fudge has been this team's best player. I think Berserker absolutely deserves to be mentioned in that category as well. And then for Sven, obviously a lot of controversy surrounding Sven, his talk on the dive and everything like that. We'll get into the series against TL later in the week, which I'm happy to talk about. But Sven is a good player. He's a very good support. Maybe not one that I would consider in the top, 2 supports in the region or anything like that, if only just because I'm not sure he has ever really stood out to me as, actively winning games for his team in the same way that, some games Core JJ just wins for his team, and some games Vulcan just wins for his team. I think a player like Ayla could absolutely be that in the support position as well, who he has been that in the past. I don't think Sven has ever felt like that to me. Maybe it's just because he's surrounded by incredibly good talent. He's surrounded by Berserker in the bottom lane, but Sven's a very solid support, not someone who's going to give you a lot of problems, someone who is going to make your team a little bit more cohesive, and him and Berserker genuinely have fantastic chemistry in the bot lane, and so, those two are obviously great. You don't need to hear me talk about how great those two are, but they were the ones who really stood out to me. The top side was good as well. Fudge certainly got taken advantage of a bit in the early game, if only because Santorin spent a lot of his resources up on topside trying to get that Jace ahead. Unfortunately, I'm not really sure that was the right move. I understand maybe wanting to get topside ahead, but if you're going to do that, maybe Jace isn't the pick, because Jace can't really snowball the game out of control, especially going in to something like Lucian. And that kind of brings us to talking about Dignitas, which is just kind of a sad story. I mean, this team is 0-7. They don't look like they have any fight in them at all. This bot lane sucks. I mean, they really are bad. Spawn is going to get my dud of the game again here. I believe that's his 6th in their 7 games. I believe the only one he didn't get went to Santorin, who I want to make abundantly clear is also not playing well. I know a lot of people are saying, oh, Santorin and Jensen are elo stuck on this team with Armut, Spawn, and Ignar. And while I guess I can understand where you're coming from, because these two players have been good in better scenarios in the past, both of them are playing at a really low level, and I would argue that this team could actually genuinely be pretty good if Santorin and Jensen were actually playing well. Not pretty good, but they wouldn't be 0-7 if these two were actually, functioning at a level. Losing bot lane happens in other regions. We've seen other teams have bot lanes that just cannot win. The Kwangdong Freaks come to mind, having a bot lane that just cannot win against any other bot lane in the region, but they have other players on that team, and Bulldog and Ndudu in the top lane, that can actively make things happen and surprise a lot of teams. Jensen has not been that, and I know we can talk about Jensen being a good player, but a lot of people on the internet are coming after Bjergsen really hard for being way too passive, for not making any plays happen before 20 minutes, for not roaming, for not making the aggressive calls. How come nobody is on Jensen for doing the same exact thing? I understand that the lanes and the situations around him are different, but at the end of the day, the killer instinct is not a part of Jensen's vocabulary. He is a supportive mid laner, and this was the problem we were worried about with Dignitas going into the year. Santorin, somebody who doesn't really want resources, wants to put them on someone else. Jensen, someone who doesn't really want resources, wants to put them on someone else. There really isn't anybody on this team that is both good enough to carry games at an LCS level, and also is the kind of player that will carry games at an LCS level, and we're seeing that become a problem. I think the closest you have is Armut in the top lane, but he is so inconsistent that it's really hard to even consider him, an option there. And so right now, honestly, Dignitas at 0-7, it just makes a lot of sense considering their playstyle and, what has been going on. It's certainly not something I predicted. I don't want to get that mixed up. It's not like, oh, it makes sense that, I definitely saw that coming. I certainly did not see this coming, but it wasn't out of the realm of possibility for this team to disappoint. It just feels like every single fear that you could have possibly had surrounding this team has come true this year. But as for C9, you look pretty good here. I still don't really know where the top 3 or 4 teams kind of stand. Top 3 feels pretty locked in, especially with the EG's win earlier on day number 1 here that we already covered. But C9's still a really solid team if they can get stuff together. Fudge and Berserker as a duo is probably the second most scary carry duo in the league behind Vikla and Prince, and so it's a very difficult team to imagine them not being relevant for the rest of the year, but for now, they just are a little bit inconsistent. But if they play like this, if they get this really good idea of how to win the game into them, and you can get Berserker and Sven super far ahead, the rest of the team can support, they're going to be relatively unstoppable because of just the pure talent on this team. And now moving on to our final game of the first day here in this Super Week. It was a pretty interesting one. 2 teams that I would say really are kind of surprising with how good they have been over the past few games. We had TSM taking on Golden Guardians, and Golden Guardians pick up another strong win. They've been on a huge win streak, I say, as of 3 wins in a row. It's a pretty big win streak for them, though. They sit now at 3-4 after this win. Really, really solid bounce back from some early season problems. Obviously, Gory wasn't here. That was a big part of their team. Gory obviously being this team's best player. It's really good for them to get him back and for him to be, kind of functioning as well as he possibly could have. Obviously, I was a little bit up and down on Gory's tape going into the year. He's someone who I've followed for quite a few years on this channel, who I've talked about a considerable amount. I was super high on him when he was on Nongshim. I was a lot lower on him last year when he was on FPX, and then eventually PSG when it really felt like he wasn't playing all that well. But coming over here to NA, it's a completely different circumstance. It's a completely different league that you're going into, and Gory honestly looks great in this league, but he's not the player of the game. Hell, he's not even the lane that really dominated the most. That has to go to this bot lane, who has really, really, really stepped up in the last few weeks. They have played really, really solid. They were the main carries for Golden Guardians, I would say, last week when they went 2-0, and that definitely has started again here. Stixxay is going to get my player of the game, but you could very realistically give this to Huhi as well. These two have both been playing at a very high level for Golden Guardians over the past few weeks, not only in lane, but especially out of lane. Obviously, the Zeri coming out for Stixxay. TSM's had their problems with the Zeri pick this year. Not really sure why they don't just ban it if Neo doesn't want to play it, and if they don't want to play against it. I'm not sure why they don't just ban it, but it's up again, and Golden Guardians takes it, and they're able to win with it. Stixxay has been very good on the Zeri this year. That's kind of been the signature pick, I would say, for Stixxay so far in 2023, and then Huhi pulls out the Annie. We've been seeing this pick rise in popularity a lot over the past week or so. Obviously, she's super unbalanced right now in terms of the amount of damage and CC that she's able to output basically for free, but credit to these two. You still have to play the lane really well, and they won lane. Winning lane as Zeri into Sivir isn't the easiest thing in the world, and so you still got to go out there and execute on that. I thought Stixxay and Huhi were phenomenal at doing that. Credit to River, who I thought did a really good job of also helping them get ahead. But Stixxay and Huhi truly have been one of the more dynamic bot lane duos in the entire league, right up there, with Prince and Winsome and with Berserker and Sven, right? Honestly, Stixxay and Huhi over the past few games have been right up there with the rest of them, and it's been pretty fun to watch. Hopefully they can keep it up, because I'm obviously a big fan of both of these players, longtime LCS fan, so it's hard not to cheer for players like Stixxay and Huhi, who have been veterans and been around the block, once in a while. It's good to see them really starting to kind of get back into their groove, closer to what they were, I would say, in their prime. But the rest of this team is also playing well. Like I said, River looked good. Licorice still does feel like a little bit of a weak link, is oftentimes in poor positions at least once per game, but it's not enough where the rest of the team is really going to fall behind and get punished for it. He's fine in the top lane, just not someone I would consider a strength, but that's okay when your bot lane is playing like this. I really do think that's what Golden Guardians is going to be kind of hung up on, and I'll talk about that in a bit, but I really think the difference between Golden Guardians being a top 5 team in the LCS and being a top 7-ish team in the LCS is how this bot lane is performing. If Stixay and Huhi can play like one of the top 4 or 5 bot lanes in the entire region, this team is probably going to be a top 5 team in the LCS, but it's just about the consistency and whether or not they're going to be able to do that for the entire season, because we know what we're probably going to get out of this jungle mid duo, and it's probably going to be good. As for TSM on the other side, frustrating loss. I mean, you just weren't as good as Golden Guardians, which is definitely intriguing considering how both of you have started the season, but it's not particularly surprising when you look at the two teams on paper. My dud of the game is going to go to Neo in the bot lane. He's just kind of been nothing for this TSM team. This is kind of what we thought he was going to be going into the year. You know, obviously, Aphromoo, the rookie AD carry whisper, no longer here with Neo. He wasn't particularly good last year on Dignitas when Aphromoo left as well, and he's got another really good support on this team in Chime, someone who I really like a lot, and this lane is just basically never won for the side of TSM. Like, this is a very negative lane on the side of TSM. It doesn't really matter that Maple actually does a really good job in the early game of being able to contest Gory, because he does. He's actually relatively even with Gory basically throughout the entire game. But bot lane loses hard enough where Stixay and Huhi are able to get out on the map a lot earlier, especially during that Rift Herald play, and then Boogie just has no pressure compared to River, and so the game is basically over at that point. But for TSM, you do have some upside on this roster, right? Like, Maple is playing well right now, which was a big question mark for you. I like Chime as a player. Boogie's shown moments of being really good. Solo's shown moments of being really good. I just don't know if it's enough, right? Like, I feel like they are a solid team, you know, one of those teams that is pretty consistently going to find themselves in like 7th place in a lot of the regions, but I really have no idea if they're actually good enough to be a top 6 team. They really don't have it on paper. We all knew that going into the season. They have outperformed it a bit, but I really don't know if any of the performances that they have given so far has given me enough confidence to be like, yeah, this is definitely like a playoff top 6 team. I really just don't know if I feel like that. I think bot lane is a problem for this team because Neo is just not very good. He's just going to be a lower end AD carry in the region. It's not a huge problem. Like, he's not going to demolish your game by himself, but he's not going to be a strength when your team is losing by any means. And I think you could say the same thing for like Solo in the top lane, who is a really good player and can have really good pop-off games, but oftentimes it's the rest of the team helping him out with that. Boogie, Maple have both shown flashes of being good, but both were incredibly inconsistent, especially in a lot of their losses. And so TSM just feels like an okay team that has an opportunity to at least contest some of these other kind of more interesting teams in the LCS. But for Golden Guardians, they are very quickly becoming one of those more interesting teams in the LCS. And I, for one, am hoping that they just can continue that as the season goes on. It's a lot of fun to watch a player like Gory just be really good in the mid lane, but I mean, truthfully, I gotta hand it to Stixay and Huhi. They really have genuinely been phenomenal over the past few games. The focal points of Golden Guardians, and if they can keep that up, not only is that a great story for us long-term LCS North American fans, but it's also a really good sign for Golden Guardians, who might be a legitimate contender for some of the top teams in the league. That does it for day number 1, but now we get to move on to day number 2, and we kicked off day 2 with a matchup between Team Liquid and Evil Geniuses, and this was actually very similar to EG's first series of the week, a little bit different in terms of how it ended, but we're starting to get a little bit of a pattern when it comes to EG and how they like to play out their end games, and it's not a particularly good pattern, but it is one that exists nonetheless. So let's go ahead and talk about it. They were able to take the game in 44 minutes. They did a really good job in the early game being able to generate leads. Inspired is just so good at early game pathing. He can basically beat anybody in the league in the early game. He is really, really smart about where he needs to be and where he wants to be at any given time, and he makes sure that the enemy jungler doesn't really have a lot of counterplay options to it. One of the things that EG does particularly well, because of how pushed up a lot of their lanes end up being, is tracking the enemy jungler. They often do a really good job of making sure they can get deep vision. I would argue they're probably the best team in the league at that right now, and it really does show pre-15 minutes at how Inspired likes to play the map, how JoJo likes to play the map, and how they like to create a lot of those advantages in the early game. Now, that's not to say their mid game is bad. I actually think their mid game is fine for the most part. They know what to do. They know how to transition. It's just once we hit that 20-minute mark, it's like, oh, well, what do we do now? I don't know. And that just feels like Evil Geniuses in 2023. It happened in game number 1 against 100 Thieves this week. It happened again here against Team Liquid, where they had all the advantages in the world, but they knew their comp got a little bit outscaled, so they didn't want to take all of these full aggressive skirmish attacks, if only to make sure that TL didn't get online and get to the point in the game where they could actually contest. They didn't want to make too many mistakes, but in doing so, you kind of gave TL too much time to get back online. You're looking at a very similar comp to what 100 Thieves actually had in that earlier game. You've got the Azir, you've got the Caitlyn. You know, Caitlyn obviously known as a more early game champion, but Jhin does a really good job neutralizing the Caitlyn early, first and foremost. I think Jhin is really good at that. But also, Caitlyn scales incredibly well into the late game. She's not particularly strong in the mid game at around 1 or 2 items, but when you're hitting 4-item Caitlyn, like, she's going to do a metric boatload of damage damage. I'm trying not to curse. This is why it took me so long to think of a word there, but she can do a boatload of damage, and you're hitting a point in the game where TL is actually in a really good position to win fights. Unfortunately for TL, they might be the least coordinated team in the LCS, which is certainly an achievement considering how uncoordinated some of the other teams in the LCS are, but watching them genuinely reminds me of, like, Nongshim over in the LCK, where it's like, it's a team of talented players who kind of know what to do in the early game, but they just have literally no clue what to do once we get to 20 minutes. That's Team Liquid. Luckily for EG, that's what they ran into in this game, so they were able to pull it out. Credit to FBI, I thought he was actually really good the whole game. He did a really good job on the Jhin, being able to generate that lead early, and then honestly was by far the most consistent player on the team in terms of the back half of this game. A lot of people are going to look at the score lines, and they're going to be like, Someday was really good here, and yes, kind of. Someday was also out of position a couple times in this game, and I really do think if there was a little bit more pressure in the side lanes, this game would have ended a lot earlier. You could give some credit to JoJo. I thought he played the Jace really well, but there's only so much you can do on Jace in a lot of these fights when you don't really have a lot of initiation, but Inspired, Vulcan, they were just kind of meh in the late half of the game. I understand Inspired was really good towards the beginning, and obviously Maokai engages towards the back half are always going to be useful, but just in terms of the plays that they wanted to make and the plays that they were actively there for, it just didn't feel like EG was really pushing the tempo all that much, and that was a little bit disappointing. So FBI looking good. I thought, JoJo looked good. Those were the kind of main players that I think stood out to me for EG. As for TL, you're going to be disappointed you lost this game because you really shouldn't have. Again, another game where EG just kind of let their opponent lose rather than them win, which isn't a great sign for EG, but it's an even worse sign for Team Liquid that they were given an opportunity to win the game and that just felt like they didn't want to take it. Pioshik was atrocious in the early game here. He was really bad on the Jarvan, was constantly being tracked, was never able to get any sort of lead, was just never in a position to actually give TL any sort of advantages in the game, but he's not my dud of the game. That's going to go to Harry in the mid lane. I wanted to give it to Harry because I feel like I want to be consistent with my duds of the game that I've given out over the course of the week. And this Azir game was very similar to Bjergsen's, was very similar to Jensen's, where it's just like, dude, you're an Azir and it's 40 minutes into the game. Go try and fight. Like, do something. You have hit your power spike. You don't need to sit there and farm anymore. You don't need to play super passive. And even on a champion like Azir in the early game, you can still do a lot of pressuring if you want to play with your jungle, but it just doesn't seem like NA mids have that killer instinct in them when they play this champion. It just feels like they are super willing to get passed over in the early game, give the other team an advantage, and just hope that it gets to the point where they can win. It's crazy that they actually got that in this game, but, TL's communication, their team fighting in particular, is so bad that it ended up not mattering. So Harry's going to get my dud of the game. I really do think that Pioshik also deserves dud of the game, but you can kind of flip between the two of them. Both of them were pretty bad here. Yon was doing 0 damage. Core was not useful. Summit was not useful. Pretty much everybody on TL is just not very good right now. There really isn't a lot of other ways to say it. They're just not very good right now. This is a team that lacks cohesion. They lack direction. And that's going to be a huge problem for them for the rest of the year until they fix it. I don't really know what the fix is right now, but this is not a good team that is struggling against a better opponent. This is a bad team that is being given opportunities and still can't capitalize on them. TL right now is not looking like a team that deserves to be in the top 6, and that is very apparent. As for EG, for being the second-ranked team in the standings and in the power rankings, you really haven't made me feel super good about that, but outside of FlyQuest, I wouldn't say anybody in the LCS has looked particularly phenomenal, but EG right now are at least winning games. They at least win early games as well. That is something that I do think is going to be very important for their success down the line. They were able to do that in this game, and they've been able to do that very consistently in a lot of games. I think FBI is playing at a super high level right now. Inspired's playing well. JoJo has kind of gotten back on track after a rough early start to the year. Vulcan's playing all right. Some days okay up in the top side. I think they have talent on the team, and some players are playing well, but if you can really unlock everybody on the roster and get them all playing up to kind of the levels they had all been playing at their peak before this year, I think EG can still be one of the teams that contends for an LCS trophy. It's just, despite winning this, it's not exactly the most pleasing win in the world. Moving on to our second game of day number 2 now, though. We had another matchup, kind of interesting, but it is a top T versus a bottom team. We had Immortals taking on Cloud9, and Cloud9 gets the job done, 28 minutes. Not really a tough experience, not really a too difficult one for Cloud9, but there were certainly some moments where it looked like Immortals was doing okay in this game. It's just unfortunate that as a team, as a unit, they're not particularly as strong as a team like C9. So let's talk about C9 first. Actually, no, let's talk about the game first. The first thing that you will notice when watching this game is, oh my god, Revenge is destroying Fudge in the top lane. Like, this was a huge top gap through the first 10 minutes of the game. A really good job by Revenge. But then you get the teleport bot from Fudge. He's able to pick up, like, what, a double or a triple kill or something from that. And then all of a sudden the game is over, right? Like, you've got a 3-kill Jax, you've got Berserker scaling, you've got Sven here on his best champion in the Lulu. Blabber is everywhere he needs to be on the Maokai. Like, the game is over at that point. It's gotta be super frustrating for your Immortals, because Revenge, quite frankly, was top-gapping Fudge for most of the early game here. It just wasn't able to translate into anything, but credit to C9, credit to their macro calls, and honestly, credit to Blabber, who I thought was phenomenal in this game. I know he's not going to get a lot of the attention because he was on the Maokai, and Maokai, generally speaking, isn't going to be nearly as highly prioritized, highly sought after in terms of, like, player of the game as, like, you know, the 9-2 Jax that was doing a ton of damage towards the back half and couldn't actually die. Or even the 6-kill Zeri that is piloted by the best Zeri in North America, right? Like, there are a lot of candidates, I think, on the table that come up a little bit before Blabber's name, but he was everywhere he needed to be. He knew exactly where he wanted to be at any given time. His jungle pressure was immense. He way out-jungled Kevin in the early game, was able to generate a really strong lead on the Maokai, and then got into the point where he really wanted to focus bot lane. That was really the focus, and obviously you send Fudge down there, you get all the kills on Jax, and then all of a sudden your plans change. You want to play through the Jax now. Blabber adapts. Blabber knows where to go. Blabber knows where to be. He's just one of those junglers that you are so happy to have because he can do literally anything you want. I know we all associate Blabber with aggression and skirmishes and Scuttle Crab and whatever, you know, the memes and blah, blah, blah. But put him on Maokai, put him on Gragas, put him on these more supportive oriented junglers. He's still going to be one of the best junglers in the entire West. Like, he just is that kind of player. He's really, really good, and he deserves to get his flowers for it. Credit to Fudge. You know, it's hard to really kind of give Fudge a ton of credit for this game, if only because it felt like, obviously, it was the macro that saved him and not the micro, but hey, macro is a way to win games, especially at the pro level. However you get those kills, it doesn't particularly matter as long as you're getting the gold. And they got the gold on the Jax. He did really, really well after he was able to get that lead in the top side. He was able to make Revenge's life a lot more difficult in the side lane, and then he did a really good job in those late game team fights. You know, they were trolling a bit towards the back half there, Fudge in particular, jumping just a tad bit too deep, but for the most part, they were still fine, and Cloud9 was looking great. As for Immortals on the other side, you gotta be a little frustrated. Poor Revenge. He really does feel a little bit hard stuck on this team. There are games where a player like Tactical looks good. There are games where a player like Kenvi looks good. Fleshy's had some moments, but Revenge really feels like the only player on this team that is genuinely, like, actually winning in any part of the game, and he looked good on the top side here. It just wasn't going to be enough. Cloud9 did a lot of really good macro rotations, obviously getting Fudge, you know, all that gold down on the bot side, and then basically from that point the game was over, but you gotta take a lot away from this bot lane. I know we talked about Tactical having moments where he's looked really good. He's obviously had a lot of those, but the inconsistency that he has shown the past year or so is absolutely still here. Like, that is not going away at all. He had a really bad game here. Fleshy had an awful game here. This is probably his worst game of the split. Usually when this bot lane goes wrong, I can point to Tactical being way overextended and trying to make plays that he has no right making, him and Fleshy just not being on the same page, but Fleshy in this game was the one that was just constantly out of position, constantly targeted by Cloud9, constantly put in a position where he was going to die, and the Ashe really accomplished basically nothing the entirety of the game. So he's going to get my dud of the game for this one for Immortals, but, you know, Kenvi was really bad. He got out-jungled by Blabber. This was one of his worst games of the year so far. He's actually been relatively consistent, at least in the early game, and obviously Blabber's a little bit of a different beast than a lot of the other junglers you're going to face, but you would have hoped to have seen a little bit better from him. Overall, I would just say that Immortals looks meh. Like, they look like the 8th or 9th best team in the league. It's not particularly surprising to see them this low, but it is a little bit unfortunate to see the bot lane continue to struggle. You would hope to see some flashes because I do think that they have talent and there are flashes there, but it's just not going to come true in a lot of these circumstances. It really does feel like Revenge and Kenvi are the two players that are the most consistent on this Immortals team, but in this game it was certainly Revenge. And then for Cloud9, you were able to pick up the win. That's all that really matters here. You're sitting at 6-2. That's a really good record through the first 8 games. I know not everything has been perfect for you. You're hoping that mid lane becomes a positive at some point. You're hoping Blabber can get a little bit more consistent. Obviously, we know who Blabber is, but he hasn't had the best of regular seasons so far. But you're looking at Fudge, who's an MVP candidate. You're looking at Berserker, who's an MVP candidate. Sven's been really good in the support position. Cloud9's got a lot of talent, and they are playing well. They're playing like a top team. It's just how much of a top team? A top team to actually compete for number 1, or just a team that's going to fall to FlyQuest? I guess we're going to have to see as the season goes on. Moving on now to our third game of day number 2, and it was one I was really interested in. One team kind of on the downswing, the other mostly been consistent all year long, but we actually had a little bit of an upset here as we saw Counter Logic Gaming taking on 100 Thieves, and CLG picking up a really strong win. Obviously, they've looked pretty horrendous over the past few weeks, 0-4 in their last 4 before they won on day number 1, but getting another really big win here on day number 2 over a very good 100 Thieves team is certainly enlightening for CLG fans. This is basically what you get being a CLG fan. You know, obviously they're the KT roster of NA. I'm sure I'm not the one breaking that news to anybody, but they're going to win against teams that are good. They're going to lose against Immortals like they did last week, but really good look for CLG, and honestly, you can't talk about this game without talking about Dokes. Big Dokes up in the top lane. I already talked about him a bit in their first series of the week, but you gotta talk about him again here. That's 2 straight games of Aurelia And something tells me he's just never going to get this champion again. I mean, it is legit unfair when he gets to play this champion. We saw him dive into the backline against TL in that team fight and take out 3 people by himself. We saw him 1v3 again in this game against 100 Thieves. Tenacity, no problem. Closer, no problem. Bjergsen, no problem. Dokul wins. Big Dokes just wins those. That's what he does. So, easy choice for player of the game. He has been really good over the past 2 games. I've always been a big fan of Dokul. I've talked about it a bit on this channel. He's really making a case to be like a top 3 or 4 top laner in NA right now, and I don't even think that's really all that crazy to say, what with how like Summit's underperforming, and Someday really hasn't been like that guy. If you can talk about whether you want to rank him above or below him, but right now, Dokul at least deserves to be in that conversation for top 3, top 4 in the region, and that's super, super fun for Dokul. I really hope he can keep this up. When he gets these aggressive picks, he's really good. People forget that he's also really good on tanks, but he's just not, it's not as showy as he is on picks like Aurelia. This is his classic, and he never fails, I should say, to disappoint on it. Everybody else on the team was also good. Contracts dominated this jungle matchup. We'll get to Closer in a bit, but Contracts on the Vi had pressure for days. That, really was kind of the story of this with CLG. Just having pressure for days, and 100 Thieves really not being able to play the game at all, and so Topside was really the big conduit of that, in my opinion. Dokul and Contracts really setting them forward a lot of time, and then Luger and Poom also really good in the bot lane, in my opinion, but that top side is really what did it for CLG. As for 100 Thieves on the other side, a frustrating loss in the sense of you really don't want to be losing to a team like CLG, but obviously CLG can be a team that beats basically anybody in the region. We saw that throughout 2022. We definitely saw that in week 1 of 2023 here as well, but you're starting to get a little concerned about how some of these players are performing. I've really liked how Doublelift obviously has been performing over the start of the year, but I'm going to be entirely honest, watching their 2v2s, him and Busio don't honestly seem to be on the same page a lot of the time. Busio likes to play a lot more forward than Doublelift does. I'm not exactly sure if that's just, how they like to play the lane, but sometimes it can cost the support, and sometimes it can cost the AD carry, because you can leave yourself open to some other plays around the bot lane, but I just haven't loved how Busio has been playing the early part of this split. I don't think he did anything egregiously bad in this game, but Busio, I think, has been a little bit to start the year, and the other player that I think has quite frankly just been a little meh to start the year is Closer, and I don't think I'm really breaking any minds here by saying this. I've talked about this on the channel. If you're a follower of the LCS recaps that I've been doing all year so far, you'll know this is not the first time I brought up that Closer has been very disappointing to start the year, and anybody who watched my recaps last year will know I was much lower on Closer in the regular season last year than a lot of other people were as well. I thought he had a pretty disappointing split overall compared to, what his expectations were. That has carried over. He's going to get my dud of the game here. I don't really know what you're thinking as a Jarvan diving in on an Aurelia just to get killed. Like, some of those decisions are just kind of poor, and one of the big things that is concerning me with Closer, and one of the things that really separated him as a player the first couple of times that he was, when he was on Golden Guardians, and then the first couple splits he was on 100 Thieves, was his ability to generate early leads so consistently. He was probably the single best early game jungler in the entire league, and that has not been the case this split so far. In fact, I would argue that his early games have been quite poor. So some things to consider. He did pull out one of his signature picks in Jarvan, probably the pick I most associate with him, or at least for now. Obviously, there's a couple others, but Jarvan definitely comes to mind for him, and he was pretty bad on it, so that's definitely something I think I don't want to say worry about, but, if 100 Thieves is going to disappoint and maybe not be a top 4 team, like, they feel like they've locked in over the first couple weeks, Closer disappointing is definitely an avenue to get to that, because for as much shit as Bjergsen is getting, I think a lot of that should be directed to Closer instead. And I know I'm a Bjergsen apologist on this channel, right? But in my opinion, Closer has been significantly more of a problem for this 100 Thieves team than Bjerg has been. Tenacity was also not very good, got completely run over by Dokul in the top lane, but sometimes that happens. You're playing against Dokula's Aurelia. I don't think any top laner in NA deals with Dokula's Aurelia well. We've seen that in Champions Queue with him, like, actively 3v1ing in Champions Queue every game he gets this champion. He's just a little bit of a difference maker, and Tenacity, for the most part, has actually been pretty good to start the year, so I'm willing to overlook this one game a tad bit more, because I think the rest of his games have been good, which is why I think I'm a little bit more hesitant to say the same about his teammate in Closer. But overall, kind of a rough loss for 100 Thieves. I don't necessarily want to panic and say that this team is in a bad spot, because CLG really is one of those teams that can beat anybody on any given day. But 100 Thieves probably wanted to win this, and you don't really want to be dropping games to teams outside of the top 4. If you are in the top 4, it's really not something that you should be doing, and it's probably going to separate you from the other teams in the top 3, and that's just where we are with 100 Thieves right now. I still think they're very talented, but the problems are starting to come to the surface, and it's going to be interesting to see how they adapt. But as for CLG, on the other hand, they look good so far this week. 2-0 to start the week. Obviously, Super Week means 3 games, but Dokula is looking like the best player in the league right now, and that's really awesome. Contracts had a good game. Luger and Poom, when they're weak side, are still really, really solid. That's a big reason why I like Luger, is he can be strong side, he can be weak side, he can be whatever. And then Palafox on Talia, he was playing it a ton last year, and he did a really good job. He's always played really well into Bjergsen as a player in particular, and so Really good win for CLG, and this top side is legit. If they continue to play like this, I mean, they're scary. They can beat any team in the entire region. It's always, always, always just going to be about consistency with this org. Moving on now to our fourth game of day number 2, and it's a big upset. The biggest upset in the LCS this year by far. We saw TSM taking down the undefeated FlyQuest, being the first notch in FlyQuest's cap here, their first loss of the year. An incredibly huge upset for TSM, a big win for this team, for this org. Fly didn't play particularly well in this one. A lot of their flaws, kind of came out, I would say, and got exposed. I'm not going to say that they are replicable by other teams, because that's certainly something that we're going to have to see as the season goes on, but TSM did a really good job of generating leads in the way that they knew how and really pressuring those leads. And honestly, I was very impressed with how TSM played this game out. It was more so TSM taking advantage of a lot of good plays that they were making rather than FlyQuest slipping up. TSM was genuinely very good here. So let's go ahead and talk about it. Player of the game for me is going to go to Maple in the mid lane. Obviously, the memes are running wild. Maple versus an LCK team. Maple versus, Impact, Vikla, Prince, Winsome, 4 originally Korean players. Obviously, Winsome, Impact, NA residents, but Maple destroying the LCK once again. It's just kind of what he does in his career. He was awesome in this game on the Talia. Definitely deserved player of the game. There were a couple of really fantastic plays coming out from other members of the team, but Maple, to me, was the one who stood out the most as the player that was kind of just winning lane and moving around the map really effectively. He did a really good job to generate an early lead on the Jace, which is actually incredibly difficult to do as the Talia. Very difficult unless you get a lot of jungle attention, which Boogie was very happy to give him. Now, credit to Boogie. I want to talk about him a bit here as well. He played like an absolute madman in this game. The Vi can sometimes get a little bit outscaled in a lot of these games because you get to the point, and I talk about this on the channel a lot, sorry for the longtime viewers, but you often get to a point in the game where Vi's going to ult your backline target, CC them while you're being ulted, and then immediately die, because Vi doesn't really have the sustain or the tankiness to be able to survive going in that deep late in games. And so oftentimes Vi really needs to be ahead or needs to be on a team that can burst down really quickly in order to be as successful. But Boogie doesn't care. He's going to go in anytime he's got that R up, hell, anytime he's got the Q up, he's going all in, and he played the mid lane matchup, I thought, really well, which is really crazy to say, but really punishing Jace's lack of early mobility outside of the gate. If he used it really aggressively, Boogie was always there to try and punish him for it. But obviously, those two definitely weren't the only members of TSM to play well here. I gotta shout out Solo up on the top side. I know his score doesn't look all that good, and that's because FlyQuest definitely had a game plan, which was target Solo on the top side here, try to make sure that Cho'Gath doesn't get online. Unfortunately for them, 0-5 Cho'Gath is the power spike for Solo. He retained the mental after a really rough early game and was able to be super impactful towards the back half of the game. This champion is the ultimate tank. He was out-tanking Scion's damage towards the back half with significantly less gold, which was super impressive, and then obviously the execute is so good, and he actually does relatively good damage. Cho'Gath is a pick that I actually think is super being slept on in the meta right now. It's a top laner that I think does really well into things like the Scion, even something like the Cassante I think Cho'Gath can do relatively well into, and we saw that here, a very tanky comp, a Scion, a Maokai, a Thresh even. Cho'Gath does really well into those super tanky comps, and I thought this was a great example of that. And then the other player that you really have to shout out as playing honestly genuinely awesome was Chime. Chime in the support position, his recon is just so clean, it is so smooth, it is so fun to watch. Honestly, any of these 4 players could have gotten player of the series or player of the game, maybe except for Solo, just because that early game did happen, but Boogie made some awesome plays, Maple made some incredible plays on the Talia, and Chime was basically perfect on this recon. Those 3 were so ridiculously phenomenal, especially towards the back half of the game. They did a really good job knowing where to generate their leads, and then they weren't afraid to pressure FlyQuest. They didn't get strung up on the idea that they are beating a team that they're supposed to lose to. They remained calm, they remained in control, and they kept pushing on forward, and they ended up winning the game because of it in relatively clean fashion, and that's just a super impressive thing to see from TSM. As for FlyQuest on the other side, certainly not the way you wanted to get your first loss of the season. You were probably hoping it was to a better team than TSM, but credit to TSM, they played really well. FlyQuest just didn't get out of the gate very quickly. Spica lost the jungle matchup pretty early. Boogie had a lot of pressure on the map. That's pretty typical of the Vi into Maokai matchup. Vi is typically going to have a little bit more pressure in the early game. It's all about the Maokai to kind of, wait it out and get to the point where he can be incredibly strong in the team fight phase towards the back half, but the Jace losing early was not expected. I think Prince not really getting online was was a problem, and they invested a lot into that top side and really didn't get a lot out of it. A lot of the gold ended up going on to the Maokai, which is just not good allocation of that gold, and you end up at a point at around 10 minutes where you're just down in gold, and now it's up to TSM to make mistakes, and instead of making mistakes, they just made all the right plays and won the game. My dud of the series, or my dud of the game, is going to go to Winsome in the support position. Just wasn't particularly clean on the Thresh, was going in a little bit too much, especially towards the mid-game, in my opinion. You can say the same thing about Spica. I think both of them, quite frankly, were bad this game. Neither of them were really all that good, but Winsome, I think, stood out a little bit more because of the crystal clean engages that were coming out from the other side with TSM. The Vi engages, the Rakan engages, they were all so nice and so well coordinated that it really juxtaposed, I think, how poor some of the Thresh engages were on the other side. But it really was a little bit of a team loss, I would say, for FlyQuest. It really didn't feel like one player throwing the game, one lane losing super hard, and the game was over. That's definitely not what it felt like it happened for FlyQuest. It was just small, gradual wins for TSM, some really good macro in the mid game, and then them closing him out. Honestly, this felt like a 2017 TSM game, you know, with Bjergsen and Svenskeren and Wild Turtle and that whole team, even Double Lift, right? Like, slow and steady and calculated and methodical, and it was a really, really good win for TSM. FlyQuest shouldn't be bothered. You were bound to get your first loss sometime. At least it happened here, so you can kind of rebound and not maybe have that weight on your shoulders as you move into the second part of the round robin here, but you know, definitely probably didn't want it to be to TSM. But on the other side, TSM looking really good in this game. Honestly, a lot better than I ever thought they would against a top team like FlyQuest. If they can keep this up, this is a team that legitimately should be top 6. This is a top 6 easy level performance. I'm just hoping that they're going to be able to replicate it as the season goes on. That's going to bring us to our final game here of day number 2, and it's an interesting one. Two teams that I think started off pretty slow, but one has definitely started to rebound. We had Dignitas taking on Golden Guardians, and Golden Guardians pick up the win here. No surprise, Dignitas moves to 0-8. That's about almost as bad as it could be through the first round robin. Obviously, they've got one more game on game 3, one more opportunity to get a win in the first half of the round robin, but Golden Guardians certainly not going to give it to them here. They played really, really well in this game. This was GG all the way. A couple of hiccups here or there, but it is from the usual sources. The main sources on this team are playing so ridiculously well that it's actually astounding. We talked about Stixxay and Huhi really being a driving force for this Golden Guardians team and why I think they've really started to pick up the pace. That is absolutely the case again here in this game. Stixxay is going to be getting my player of the game again here, the second time this week that he's going to get that, this time on the Lucian, playing the Lucian Nami in the bot lane. Him and Huhi just work so well together, and they honestly do a really good job of being able to transition in the mid game. Now, this was something that Huhi was always really good at on 100 Thieves. In my opinion, it was his biggest strength as a support when he was playing with FBI, was his ability to take a winning or a losing position and make the most out of it in the mid game. You know, you can talk about Huhi making some mistakes in late game team fights, or even early on in some laning phases that really should have been won, but his mid-game prowess, I think, has always been really solid. He knows where he needs to be on the map, and he knows who he needs to target in a lot of scenarios. The pun was not intended, but it was kind of funny. And I really do think that him and Stixxay just get each other on that same page. I do want to talk about this quickly now. We will get to the Dignitas players in a bit, but a lot of blame has been put on Spawn, most of it rightfully so, some of it not so rightfully so, but you cannot blame Spawn for this game. He was the only player on Dignitas that came out and tried to do anything in this game on the Zeri. Stixxay and Huhi versus Spawn and Ignar was actually relatively close in lane, and Spawn and Ignar actually had an advantage. It was just the other leads from Golden Guardians that allowed the Lucian to get online and really take over the mid game like we know that he can. But overall, Golden Guardians still playing really well. River was awesome in this game on the Sejuani. He really has been stellar so far in 2023, way better than I thought he would be, way better than he was in summer of last year, and so that's really good. Him and Gory seem to have a really good synergy together as a jungle mid duo, and that's really going to push Golden Guardians forward. We kind of had an idea that River was going to bounce back at least a little bit. He probably wasn't going to be like a bottom 3 or 4 player like I think he was in the LCS in summer of last year, but you know, I didn't think it was going to be this, where he's like a legit asset to a team that is trying to get top 5, and Gory's awesome. You don't need me to tell you how good Gory is. Mechanically speaking, he's one of the most talented players in the league, and with honestly the weak mid lane talent, the weak mid lane pool that I've kind of talked about over the course of this video, I think Gory slots in as one of the best basically immediately, and that's a really good sign for Golden Guardians. Those 4 really make a very dangerous team to have to face in basically any scenario, especially if the bot lane is on. The only problem this team has is top lane. Licorice still not very good, picks the Lee Sin here top lane, which I actually do like Lee Sin top. I talked about it a lot when I was going over Rascal in 2022, a player that I really do like. He's kind of a Lee Sin main up in the top lane, but Licorice pulls it out here, not super effective, has some very bad plays, is the cause of pretty much all of Golden Guardians' losing plays, if you will. Licorice is a big part of a lot of those. I still think he's a very weak topside, one of the weaker ones in the entire league, and he was kind of showing that against even Armut, who I think has had a really bad split, and honestly, he played pretty poor down the stretch of this game anyways. So topside's still a problem, I would say, for Golden Guardians, but the rest of the team by far makes up for it, and they're still an actual contender. As for Dignitas on the other side, they just suck. Like, how many times can I rephrase that this team is not motivated? This team is not playing very well. It wasn't the same way that they had lost a lot of the other games. Spawn and Ignar actually won in the bot lane matchup early, which is super hard and super rare on Zeri, Lulu, into Lucianami. Big credit to them, but it was the top side of the map that just looked so uninterested, I guess, in actually playing the game out, which is definitely a little disappointing. Certainly not something that you want to see from the team. Santorin's going to be getting my dud of the game here. Really bad game from him. He's been really bad this year. I know all of the blame is going to be put on Spawn. Some of it's going to be put on Armut because he only plays Gnar, but Santorin sucks. Like, Santorin is easily this team's second worst player, in my opinion. And that's not a good sign. Like, he's supposed to be a rock. He's supposed to be an anchor. I still have faith that Santorin is a player that can kind of grow out of this. He's done so in the past from bad teams, but this is a new level for Santorin. It's not consistency. It's just nothing. He's losing early game. He's having no pressure in the mid game. He's just giving everything up, and that is never a good sign, especially playing something like Vi into Sejuani. Jensen was really bad in this game, one of the worst ones he's had in quite a while, you know, other than earlier this week, and then Armut is just nothing in the top lane, even if he was able to win early on. He just couldn't transition that into any sort of meaningful moment at all in this game. So Dig is just hopeless. Like, legitimately, I just don't know if this team is going to win a game. If they do, I don't know how they're going to do it. Maybe Jensen steps up, but outside of that, I don't know, man. Armut, maybe he just has one of these really good games. I don't think Santorin is going to get you in a winning position with the way he's playing. I don't think Spawn and Ignar are good enough. This is what a Spawn and Ignar win looks like, and it doesn't matter. So how do you win games if you're Dignitas? I don't know. That's a problem they're going to have to figure out. But for Golden Guardians, you have found the recipe to winning games. It's a really strong bot lane, especially in the mid game. A jungler who's willing to basically give everything to his laners, and a mid laner who is so mechanically talented that he can win any late game team fight. Really, really fun team here in Golden Guardians, and one that could legitimately contend for even, like, top 4 if they're really lucky. Moving on now to our final day of the Super Week. Normally, we'd be done with the video here, but we've got a whole extra day of games to go over with the LCS here to finish off the first half of the round robin, and we kick off our final day with a fun matchup between Counter, Logic Gaming, and FlyQuest. And Fly gets back on track. They weren't able to make it a perfect 9-0 through the first half of the round robin, but they were able to make it 8-1, and that is just about as good. It clears them right at the top of the standings. Nobody can even touch them by themselves. They're the only team with one loss, no matter what happens the rest of the day, and so a very impressive showing from FlyQuest. They just look like the most dominant team, and they showed it again in this game. CLG actually played relatively well. They had a very good week here, and I want to give them a lot of credit, but FlyQuest was just better, and they showed up to win in this one, and you could tell. Vikla, in particular, was a man on a mission on that Yone, one of the most disgusting melee mid performances that I've seen in quite a long time. He played that Yone incredibly strongly. He did the solo queue classic of ulting in, missing everybody, and then just killing with his auto attacks anyways. The classic Yone experience, but he was really, really good in lane. He was actually able to dominate. Palafox able to get a kill early, and then from that point on in the game, it's just over, right? Like, Vikla is just going to dominate the laning phase into a Sylas as a Yone, as the better player, and we saw that. We'll get to Palafox in a bit. Didn't exactly have the best game in the world, but Vikla was so dominant and so fun to watch. These are the kinds of explosive plays you want to see out of your mid laner. I talked about it in the previous entry, how really there aren't a lot of mid laners in North America right now that are actively trying to make plays like this to win the game. Vikla is absolutely one of them, if not the main one. There was a reason we all had him as the #1 mid laner moving into 2023, and it was this reason, because he plays like this. So really, really good game from Vikla. Everybody else also supported. The only player that I think really didn't step up to the plate and play as well here was Impact in the top lane. He was losing to Dokla, quite frankly. He wasn't particularly winning. He didn't have a lot of pressure. The Gangplank was super far ahead and was doing really good, but all of a sudden there was a Maokai and a Yone in the top lane, and then Gangplank dies, and then oops, all of that lead is now gone, and so the game is over from there. But Spica was okay. I thought Prince and Winsome were really strong at winning the 2v2 in bot lane, which is just, I mean, it's a no-brainer at this point. Prince just wins, but really this game was about Vikla's Yone, and that was the main story to get across. As for CLG on the other side, it was a good performance, genuinely speaking. This was something that they can hang their hat on. It certainly wasn't a bad performance against one of the best teams in the entire league. I mean, the best team in the entire league, but there were some flaws. My dud of the game is going to go to Palafox in the mid lane. Not a particularly good Sylas game. Not only was he not really able to stop Vikla from getting out of control, especially after that first kill, which wasn't his fault, but after that point, he kind of exacerbated the issue. You had the Sylas being able to steal a lot of ultimates. He would steal the Yone ult, go all in, miss everybody, and then instantly die. Not particularly what you want to see out of your Sylas player. He just was easily probably the least impactful member of CLG and the one that actively created the most for FlyQuest. I don't even think he was, like, atrocious. We've definitely seen worse performances in players this week already, but there was just no player that I think gave more over to the enemy team than Palafox here. I do want to give a lot of credit to the top side of the map. Like I said, Doko was doing a good job in top lane, being able to generate a lead until he got a ton of pressure, but big shout out to Contracts. He was super good this week just in general, controlling the map, being really proactive. This is the kind of Contracts I really like to see. Obviously, he can be a big carry player, and he has been that in the past for CLG, for other teams in the past. Golden Guardians comes to mind, but he's really good on these supportive, kind of engaged type champions like the Sejuani who can just create for the rest of the team. He did a really good job stemming the bleeding for CLG and making it so that by the time they got to about 20 minutes, if they were a little bit more proactive in some of these team fights, like they had a real shot to win this game. And so big credit to Contracts. I thought he played well. Luger and Poom were fine in the bot lane. They got a little bit outlaned by Prince and Winsome, but that's going to happen. I mean, Zeri into Aphelios. Aphelios has a little bit of the range advantage there. Really not a lot you can do, and so Prince was just able to win that. He's the better player anyways. But overall, CLG just genuinely looks good. Like, I really don't have a lot of negatives to say about the team. Even though they lost this game, it certainly wasn't a blowout by any stretch, and I actually think a lot of their players played well, especially their top side. So credit to CLG, really good bounce back week, even if they weren't able to complete the 3-0. As for FlyQuest on the other side, really, really good week for them. Obviously, not to their standards, not a 3-0, not what they, have been building up to this point in the season with, but still a very, very good showing from them. They absolutely demolished a good team here in CLG. Vikla looked like an absolute monster. If they're able to dominate games like this when Prince isn't even on a main carry, like someone who's getting attention, that is a huge sign for FlyQuest because it just means the team all around him is playing super well, which we already knew, but I guess it's really good to get it confirmed in this series here. Moving on now to our second game of day number 3. And it's another one that should have gone the way everyone anticipated, and it did. We saw Immortals taking on Evil Geniuses. Now, I know I haven't been super complimentary of EG throughout the week so far. I don't really think they've had a standout, like, really good game. They have really good early games, but they've really struggled to transition that into mid games, even against some teams that really aren't clicking right now, aka TL, but for EG, this was easily the most complete game they had of the week. Really, really strong stuff coming out from EG. Basically, everybody on the team held their own. I like this comp a lot for this team. They've been going for more aggressive picks on the top side, and I'm really not sure that's what this team plays for. Like, that's the strength of this team. Sunday's really good on weak side. In fact, I would argue he's the best weak side top laner in the region. Maybe Impact, obviously, but, like, those two are right up there against each other. That's what Sunday's been really good at for quite a few years. Yes, he's also really good with resources, but you have a lot of players on this team that I think really like resources. JoJo, FBI, Inspired, they all really like to be able to carry games from their role. So having Someday on something like a Scion, as opposed to like the Fiora that he's been on a couple times this year, I actually like this a lot more. You don't have to worry about him nearly as much. And then it really allows you a lot of opportunities to play for macro, and that's exactly what they did here. Jojo Pune is going to be getting my player of the game. A really great Sylas game from him. When he gets Sylas, it's just different. This is his best champion by a large margin, at least that we've seen at an LCS level, and he proves it every single time that he plays it. He's absolutely absurd on the pick. He's able to dominate lane against the Ryze. He's really able to generate a strong lead, and then what Jojo does better than almost any other mid laner in the entire region is take the wealth that he has been able to gain by generating his own lead and spread that to other people on the map. Spread that to FBI and Vulcan. Make sure that they can scale up and get that Zeri online before the Aphelios does. Spread that up into the top side, because if you can get Scion super online, no one on the enemy team is going to be able to kill them, except for the Aphelios, who, might I remind you, is now behind. Overall, really, really, really good game plan here by EG. I thought Inspired played well. I thought JoJo played well. I thought FBI and Vulcan played well. Someday was awesome in the top lane. Everyone pulled their weight for EG, and that's exactly what you want to see from a top team. As for Immortals on the other side, they just aren't very good. I had this team ranked 8th because they had some, promising signs. Tactical and Fleshy certainly had moments where they looked good, and Revenge and Kenvi were actually pretty consistently good, I would say, over the first couple of weeks, but this is what happens when you just get outclassed in every single lane. Of all of the games where I thought Immortals was going to get thrashed this week against C9, against FlyQuest, I did not think it was going to be the hardest against EG, but they just didn't look good, obviously, at all this week, and this one was really, really bad. I think anybody on this team really deserves dud of the game, maybe with the exception of Tactical, who I think was certainly making some good plays. He was very close to turning a lot of these team fights, making them a lot closer, but he just wasn't able to kind of finish them off. But give it to Fleshy, some awful Nautilus engages. Also, why are you playing Aphelios Nautilus in 2023? Give it to Kenvi, because he did nothing on the map, got completely out-jungled by Inspired and just kind of faded into the background and kind of gave up winning the game. Give it to Revenge, because Renekton as a champion does literally nothing if he's super far behind something like a Scion or a Wukong or a Sylas, who just doesn't give a shit about Renekton. But For me, it's a pretty easy choice going to go to a Blaze Olive. You can only play Ryze if you're the better player. That has pretty much always been true, but that is especially true in 2023. I talk about this a lot in my LCK and LPL reviews. Only play Ryze if you're the better player, because if not, you're going to get embarrassed. He got embarrassed in this game. JoJo walked all over him in laning phase. He had literally 0 successful plays out of it. It just was not his day. Not a very good game from him. He has been, I would say, a negative overall for Immortals this year. Probably their worst player. I don't know. It's kind of hard to tell, because they really haven't had a lot of great players, but ABO just really hasn't shown a lot of things. I was really excited about ABO as a player in his first split or two on Golden Guardians, where it really felt like, oh, he likes playing aggressive. He likes going for a lot of these plays. But the problem is just that it doesn't feel like he has the backup or the knowledge to know when to go for these plays. And that really is the deciding factor. He will make a lot of risky moves, but they will be ones that objectively will not pan out because they're not set up for. But that's Immortals, just in general. They're just okay. They're not like the worst team in the league. Obviously, they're not Dignitas, but this is not a team that is going to be competing for top 6, even though top 6 does feel wide open right now. I would say there's 8 teams in the league competing for top 6. Immortals is not one of them. The bottom 2 feel very locked in, and Immortals definitely feels like one of them. It was a rough week for them. Hopefully they can bounce back. They had some really big wins over some good teams earlier on in the season. Obviously the Dignitas game, but the CLG game was huge for them, so more of that, please. That's what I'd like to see. I'd like to see Revenge and Kenvi continue to grow. Hopefully Tactical can finally find a bot laner in this meta that he can play, because it just doesn't feel like there is one that makes him feel comfortable, and hopefully ABO can just not be a disaster for this team like I think he has been through the first couple of weeks. But for Evil Geniuses, you had a 3-0 week. It wasn't the most dominant 3-0 week of all time, but you did end 3-0, and that's a good sign. Obviously the wins over 100 Thieves and TL were not particularly great in terms of the mid game, but this one was a demolition, and really it's the win that matters. I think this team is getting on the right track. It feels like the bot lane is really strong right now, which is a huge indicator, but JoJo Inspired are back to kind of being the really strong duo force that they were. That was something I was concerned about through the first couple of weeks, is that it felt like they weren't in sync to start the season. It feels like they're back closer to what they were in 2022 summer, and that's only a good thing for EG. But if FBI and Vulcan can be an upgrade to what that bot lane was last year, that's going to be absolutely huge, and EG is genuinely looking like one of the few teams that can actually contest FlyQuest at the top of the standings. Moving on to game number 3 of day in number 3 now. We had a matchup that would have been interesting at the beginning of the year and is different for different reasons now, I will say. We had Team Liquid taking on Cloud9. Now, before we jump into anything, I'm not going to talk about the Jan Sven stuff. I just don't care. I legitimately don't care. And I know a lot of people care, but let them talk shit, let them not talk shit. I don't care. Let them do what they want. I'm just going to talk about the game, because that's what I do on this channel. So, let's talk about what C9 did right, because they were able to win this game. It was a little bit back and forth, but man, TL's late game struggles are just real. Like, they cannot play team fights. They have no clue how to win in the late game. But we'll talk about C9 first. It just feels like this team is a little bit underwhelming from what they should be. And I know that's weird to say with a team that is winning right now, a team that is 7-2, but this team should be better. Like, their wins aren't dominant in the way that I would want them to be. I'm not seeing Blabber take over a lot of these early games like I would want. I get it's Maokai into Elise, but you know, but maybe something more proactive here, maybe some kind of play that you can pull off as Blabber, and then Diplex is just nothing in the mid lane. Like, he is what he is. He's not getting any sort of pressure from Cloud9, and he's not doing anything with no pressure, so he's just kind of there. I think the player that I really want to shout out here, just because of the late game team fighting, is Fudge in the top lane. He didn't have a particularly eventful laning phase. K'Sante into Sion isn't exactly known for being the pinnacle of League of Legends, but Fudge played these late game team fights incredibly well on the K'Sante. It's really difficult to actually flank this C9 team. You've got K'Sante, you've got Victor on the backline, Rakan, who's going to be able to dash to the Xayah to keep her safe. It's really difficult to go for a flank, so it makes it even more insane that in the final team fight, which we'll get to, Pioshik went to, like, back to Korea, I guess, is the meme here, on a journey around, and by the time the fight was over, he is just getting to his flank, and it's like, dude, what are you doing? Like, you're released, you can jump in. That's your whole thing, so don't really know what the plan was there, but, you know, Blabber doing a good job keeping him safe, Fudge being a really good initiator in a lot of these team fights, and he just continues to be really strong in the top lane. Fudge and Berserker are easily this team's 2 best players right now, which is crazy considering they have Blabber, but that's a good sign, because Blabber's, it's not like he's playing awful, he's just a little bit less proactive than I would like. But Fudge and Berserker are gaining a lot of these resources, a lot more that Blabber had last year, and they're kind of being distributed to them. Berserker was also really good in this game. The Xayah and Rakan come out. I think they're almost underrated as a bot lane duo right now. I see a lot of people not even mentioning them as playable at an LCS or a pro level. I disagree with that. I think Xayah and Rakan are fine, especially into the right matchups, and especially if you're better, like they were in this matchup into Yan and Core JJ, which was relatively even. I do want to point that out. It was relatively even for a lot of the game, but Berserker and Sven doing a lot more in the late game team fight. So Overall, Cloud9 just look like the better team. Even if it isn't by a lot, they at least look cohesive. They know how to team fight in the late game, and that really was the big separator, I would say, between these two teams. And that brings us nicely to Team Liquid, who are just fumbling. Like, they're just fumbling the bag. They have nothing left. I don't know what to compliment this team on, because it doesn't really feel like they have a lot of positives going for them. They are individually talented. Players like Summit and Yawn have won laning phases pretty consistently. Summit in particular has gained a lot of leads in the top side, not particularly in this game, because he's playing Sion into Cassante, and that's a really boring laning phase that is the peak of League of Legends. But Yawn has had some really good games too. With Core, I feel like that bot lane has been relatively decent, maybe not top of the league, but decent. It's just jungle mid has not been good, and they always find a way to throw away any sort of positive that they have in the mid game, whether that's Summit just completely running it down like he did in a lot of the games before this week, whether that's Pioshik just, going to Korea on a flank on the last team fight, or whether it's Harry just playing Azir and standing within 4 pixels of the enemy and just not team fighting at all. Harry's going to get done of the game. I don't really know what to tell you. His positioning is atrocious. He was not this bad in Academy. There's got to be some level of mental pressure that is being put on him on this TL team that is just forcing all of these players to throw things away. I can't imagine what their comms are like, if they exist at all, but they cannot team fight. They cannot position. They cannot engage. They cannot disengage. They cannot peel. They can't do anything that you need to do in a team fight to win a game, and that's really disappointing because this roster just should be good, and they're not, and there are no more excuses. TL is bad, and that brings us to the, overview of this team. They're bad. They're 3-6, and honestly, they've played worse than that. They've played like a team that deserves to be in the bottom 2, bottom 3 in the LCS, and that's just not where they should be. They have talent. They have good players. Jan, I think, has been pleasantly surprising in the LCS so far. At least, he's what we expected. He's a good AD carry who's not a superstar immediately. Core is still one of the best supports in the league. He has very good laning phases consistently. He had a really good Thresh game earlier this week. And then the rest of the team is just drowning. Like, Summit can't do anything other than either be a 0 impact on the game as a tank or throw the entire game away as a non-tank. Pioshik has no jungle control. Even when he does execute some really nice early ganks on the Elise, he has no way of transitioning that into the mid game. And Harry is just bad. Like, he's just not playing well. So I don't really know what to tell you, TL fans. You're just not good right now, and that might be okay, but it's a sad reality I think we're going to have to accept. And then for Cloud9, good. You won. Great. You got to 7-2, but like I said, it's really not the most impressive win. I would have wanted to see you beat up on TL just a tad bit more. A team that, quite frankly, is really struggling. But this game was really close for a while, and it had absolutely no right to be. So credit to C9 for winning. They actually knew how to team fight towards the back half of the game. They knew where to position. They knew how to peel their backline, but it's not exactly the most flashy of victories, and they're definitely going to look for maybe a better one as the weeks come up. Moving on now to game number 4 of day number 3, and we're going to see if one team is going to go winless through the first half of the round robin. It's TSM taking on Dignitas, and TSM does pick up the win. In fact, it's a 0-kill game for Dignitas, so they have very, very quickly cemented themselves as the worst team in any major region right now. I really don't even think that's all that disputable. This team can't play the game. They can't, not let alone win, right? But they can't play the game. They are not competitive in any of these games. They are getting blown out by everyone that they are going into, and it's disappointing. Good for TSM. You're sitting at above 500 after the first round robin. That's huge. We were not expecting you to be here, so to see that I think is a really, really good sign. This team has played really well, especially recently, and I'm honestly very pleasantly surprised with how good they are. And one player that I really have to shout out is the player of the game here, Maple, who I know I've given him a couple of player of the games that maybe could go one way or another, but I gotta ask this, is it weird to put Maple in the MVP conversation? Like, would that be a weird thing to start doing? I feel like he has been so integral to what TSM has been doing this year. I'm not saying he's leading it over like Prince or Fudge or Doublelift or anybody like that, but Maple's been really freaking good for TSM, and I think he at least deserves to start getting, talked about in that zone as like a top of the league kind of player, because he really has been playing like that over the course of the first round robin. And let me tell you, I did not see that coming. This was someone who I was very low on when he came into the LCS last year in 2022, and he performed to my expectations. He was a mid to low tier mid laner in the LCS when the role was weaker, so to see him, kind of get better opponents and just smash them a little bit harder, I think is super impressive. Now, wasn't a perfect game from him. Jensen actually did have a CS lead, but the macro plays that were made from the Talia were super impressive this game, and honestly, it's hard not to shout him out because he's just been so good for TSM. The other player that I really got to shout out is Boogie in the jungle. Now, not every Boogie game has been good because he is really aggro, and sometimes he's going to throw away some advantages that the team has been able to generate, but that aggression definitely works for this team. I think they really do like playing at a fast pace. I think players like Chime really move, like moving around. Chime has always particularly liked playing with his jungler. That's what I would consider his strongest trait as a support, is pairing up with that jungle, making a macro impact on the game. It's never really been his lane 2v2, although I don't think it's bad by any stretch. And I think if Boogie and Chime can continue to be super aggressive and trying to make these mid-game plays, especially like earlier on than most teams would, around 8 minutes, I think that's going to be incredibly strong for TSM, and I think it's going to open up a lot of possibilities for them against even some teams that are more talented than them. This is a really good game from Neo. He did a really good job being able to generate that lead in the bot lane and then just keep it through the mid game. And then Solo was good in the top side on Cassante. Basically, everything went right for TSM. It's really hard to look at flaws in a game where no one died a single time. But for Dignitas, it's really hard to find positives in a game where you didn't get a single kill. I mean, this is just disaster. This team is garbage. You have to make a change. I'm going to give Spawn out of the game, but like, give it to all 5 of them. They all suck. Jensen had a CS lead at one point. That got evaporated very quickly when Maple just was like, okay, get your CS lead. I'm going to go elsewhere on the map and get kills for free. Which, I understand we all like Jensen and CS leads are cool, but like, Jensen hasn't left lane once this entire year, I don't think. And so that's a little bit of a problem against a Talia, who was able to take advantage of that macro mistake. Nobody on Dignitas played well here. There really is no one to shout out. Spawn gets it because he died the most, but he was also on a Felios in a comp where they didn't have any peel for him. So I don't really know what to tell you there. Ignar didn't play the Lulu very well. Jensen's ruining his win rate on Orianna. Santorin's the worst jungler in the league right now, and Armut is nothing in the top lane. Literally nothing. I have nothing good to say, really nothing at all to say about Dignitas. It is very difficult for me to come up with analysis on this team because, shit, I mean, they can't play the game at a high level. Like, they are just not good enough. Really, the analysis I'm going to give here is we've now seen half of a split, a whole round robin. You have to make changes. This is not acceptable. I don't care if it's Tomo and Diamond. I don't care if it's spending an exorbitant amount of money to bring someone else in from a different academy team, which I hear like, oh, Unforgiven's an academy, as if Dignitas would be able to afford Unforgiven, which they wouldn't, right? Like, we got to keep these moves realistic, and we got to keep the price tags in mind. Dignitas is not going to be able to get Unforgiven from 100 Thieves. They bought him for a reason, and they're going to keep him for a reason, unless they get like a giant money offer, which Dignitas is just not in a position to give. I think other AD carries that they can look at, obviously Tomo's been really good, but I mean, Lost, King's not here yet, but if he were there, King, right? Like, these are the other players that I would at least be asking about, but truthfully, Tomo and Diamond have been very good. I would just suggest promoting them, and then if things continue to be a problem, I like XU a lot as a player, and I think he could step into the jungle role really well because Santorin has just not been good for this team. XU gives you a lot more aggression, it gives you a lot more of a win condition, and I think this team needs that. They don't have that right now. Jensen's not a win con. I know everybody on Reddit likes to tell you that Jensen is the best player in the world and that he's hard stuck on Dignitas, but like, if anything, if we've learned anything, it's that our preseason analysis of Jensen was correct. It's that he is a more supportive mid lane player, and he just doesn't function well as the best player on a team. That's not the role he's meant to fill, and that's the role he will fill unless you get other talent around him. And so, you can say what you want about how, Santorin and Jensen are unlucky or whatever, but this team is going to have to make some changes because they're not going to win with this. Santorin and Jensen are just not enough, clearly. But this bot lane really does suck, and you need to get a replacement. As for TSM, they're good. They're above 500. I don't know if they're top 6. They're very close. I feel like top 7, even top 8, are all just like right there, like clumped into a little ball. Like, I don't really know where to put any of them. Is TL bad? Is TL okay? I don't know. Is TSM a top 6 team? Is CLG a top 6 team? Is Golden Guardians a top 4 team? Like, I don't know where to rank these teams. They're all kind of good, and it's going to be a very fun end to the LCS year because we're halfway through, and a team like TSM has super overperformed, which really just leads to more interesting matchups down the line. Moving on to our final game now of week number 4, the Super Week. A long video, but I hope you guys are enjoying it. We ended off with a pair of 4-4 teams. One of these teams is going to be above 500. One will be below. We had Golden Guardians taking on 100 Thieves, and Golden Guardians pick up the win here. Very surprising to me and to a lot of people. It very much felt like the top 4 were kind of sacred, especially going into this week, but 100 Thieves with a rough week, losing to Counterlogic Gaming, now losing to Golden Guardians. A couple of teams outside of that perceived top 4, not exactly where they want to be sitting at 4 and 5, below 500 after the first round robin. There were obviously a lot of things to like about 100 Thieves, but let me tell you, there are even more things to like about Golden Guardians right now. They are 5-4 on a 5-game win streak. This team started 0-4 through their first 2 weeks and have not lost a game since then, since Gory really got settled into the starting lineup. They have looked phenomenal, but it would be a shame to put all of the success and all of the progress that this team has made on Gory joining. I feel like that would take away from how good this bot lane has been, because genuinely, over the course of this week, I can't think of a better performing lane in the LCS than Stixxay and Huhi. Not just bot lane, but any lane in the LCS than Stixxay and Huhi. They were phenomenal. Stixxay gets his signature pick here in the Caitlyn, a phenomenal thing for Stixxay. You always remember, obviously, him really popping off in 2016, spraying on the Caitlyn, and then going to MSI and looking like the best Caitlyn in the world. That's a memory that will stick with me forever, and he's proven that again here going up against Doublelift. Some wounds never close, I guess, but you know, pairing him up with Huhi, former teammate of his, Huhi had some phenomenal, genuinely phenomenal plays on the Lux. Obviously, some people are going to point to the fail flash Q that wasn't able to get Bjergsen, but, you know, it happens. Sometimes you misjudge whether you're going to hit 1 or 2 minions. It happens. But outside of that, Stixxay and Huhi were legitimately untouchable in this bot lane. Not only did they dominate the early lane, getting the shove, being able to help out the rest of the team, but Stixxay just does so much good for the team in terms of positioning and in terms of, you know, utility. A lot of people don't look at Caitlyn as like a utility ADC, but those traps are huge and they can really turn the tide of a fight if somebody, I don't know, rocket jumps onto them. And so it can be a really big play for Stixxay to be positioned right and to get those traps in the right place, and he just always knows where to be in these games. He really hasn't had a great team around him in quite a few years. This is the best version of Stixxay, I would argue, that we have seen since Prime CLG. He's legit playing like one of the best ADCs in the LCS right now, and I, for one, am all for it. Of course, the rest of this team is also goated. River was awesome in this game. I know his scoreline doesn't look like it, but he created so much for Golden Guardians, a very real chance that he is your player of the game. Gory had those moments on Victor. You know, Doublelift cannot escape Victor blowing him up at some point in the game. He almost did, but eventually, Victor strikes on Doublelift every single game, and Licorice, for his credit, wasn't a problem in the top lane, which is really all he has to not be, right? It's just a major issue for Golden Guardians, someone who is actively helping them not win. If he's not that, the rest of the 4 members of this team are super good right now, especially Stixxay and Huhi, and that's really propelling Golden Guardians to being, genuinely speaking, one of the most dangerous teams in the LCS. As for 100 Thieves, not a good week. 0-3. That's not how you expected Super Week to go. Doublelift was right when he said this team definitely still has things they need to work on. I said this earlier, but I don't really know how to encapsulate it because I don't think their performances have been bad, but Doublelift and Busio together just don't feel like they click on the same level as a lot of the other bot laners. Like, especially comparing them to Stixxay and Huhi, it felt like Stixxay and Huhi were always in sync with what they wanted to do, where they wanted to be, who they wanted to go on, and when they wanted to go in. Doublelift and Busio just don't seem to be on that same wavelength. They haven't really all year. Even when Doublelift is playing out of his mind, that really hasn't been the case. So hopefully some of the synergy can get back. I think Closer has just been generally disappointing, but the most disappointing player for 100 Thieves this week has to be Bjergsen in the mid lane. He was not very good in this game. We criticized him earlier in the week on the Azir for being way too passive, not really making any plays happen, getting completely outroamed by JoJo and just having no pressure on the map. Well, the opposite happened here. The opposite happened in this game where he got the Tristana and he was trying to make way too many plays, and he was putting himself in bad positions, getting way overextended and getting caught out for being in those bad positions, whether it be by Huhi or by River or by somebody, right? He was in positions where he shouldn't be, and that's just not the Bjergsen we know. It was a rough week for him. It was a rough week for 100 Thieves overall. I do have a feeling they're going to be able to bounce back from this. I'm not going to worry too much about this team because I still think that they're good and talented, but 0-3 is scary, and I think when you look at the outlook of this team in general, you look at a team that really is exhibiting a lot of the worries that we had going into the year. It very much feels like if your main carries aren't performing, where is the rest coming from? Closer's been a big disappointment on the team so far. Tenacity's been really good, but he wasn't good this week, and that was a problem for 100 Thieves because they no longer had that pressure point on the top side, I should say, to take pressure away from Doublelift, who was getting a lot of pressure from enemy jungle in this game, and he just isn't going to be able to carry the game by himself. I'm not saying that Doublelift is like far and away like the best ADC in the league or anything. I'm not trying to sit here and say he's Prince or Berserker, but Doublelift has won this team a lot of games already this year. That's the playstyle that they have liked to go to, especially early on in the season, and once teams take that away, 100 Thieves have kind of shown that they don't really have a backup. Bjergsen really hasn't been able to carry other than a select few games where I think the rest of the team was also performing. And they're putting Tenacity on tank duty. So, like, what really are you to do here? I think draft-wise, get Tenacity on something that can be a little bit more proactive. I don't want to see Ornn into Renekton. I understand that Fiora was banned out, but there are other options available to you here. Even something like the Camille, I think, would be super good here for Tenacity and for the team overall. It would give them a lot of what they need, but again, maybe that's just me not wanting to see Tenacity on weak side, but Closer just needs to step up, Bjergsen needs to step up, Busio needs to step up. 100 Thieves in general need to get a lot more consistent because right now, they don't look like a top 4 team. As for Golden Guardians, they legit do look like a top 4 team. It is crazy to see how much this team has improved over the last 2 weeks, and now they're sitting at 5-4. This could genuinely be a team that competes at the top of the standings, and I don't think anybody saw that coming. FlyQuest Golden Guardians finals when? That's what we're all kind of hoping for. 2 underdog organizations, incredibly easy to cheer for. They've got a lot of fun LCS veterans, Stixay, Huhi, even Licorice, a lot of players that you like cheering for if you're an NA fan, and then 2 really good imports that play together really well in River and Gory, 2 players that I think were overlooked by other major regions that are getting a huge opportunity. They're not these big major signings that I think broke the bank. These are 2 undervalued players that are really coming in the clutch, and it's really hard not to get behind this Golden Guardians team when they're playing like this. Stixay and Huhi are phenomenal. River and Gory are great. Licorice is good enough in the top lane. Golden Guardians are awesome, and I will be cheering for them for a lot of the rest of the split. Alright, that is going to do it for my LCS Week 4 overview and analysis of all 3 days of the Super Week. I'm very excited to cover this. I hope you guys enjoyed. I'm sorry my voice is a little nasally, a little raspy. I hope I got through the video all right. I made sure to take care of the voice over the day, and so hope you guys enjoyed. Up on the screen right now, you're going to see the updated LCS standings, of course, listed from 1st to 10th in terms of standings. Any ties will just be broken in alphabetical order. In the first column on the right, you're going to see my updated power rankings. In the second, you're going to see how those have changed from last week to this week. So let's go over the biggest risers and the biggest fallers. Biggest risers this week, it's a tie. Golden Guardians jumping up to 5. I know some people are going to want them in the top 4, but I just need to see another week of 100 Thieves struggling before I officially say that they're not somewhere in the upper echelon. I still think this team is really good, but they had one really bad week. Hopefully they can learn from it and bounce back. That's more of what I'm expecting, but Golden Guardians absolutely deserves to be mentioned in the conversation. The Big 4 has very quickly, in my opinion, turned into a Big 5. The other big riser, CLG. I dropped them down a ton after the 0-4 back-to-back weeks there for them, but jumping them back up to number 7 here, 2 in 1 week. Pretty solid, only lost to a really good team, and so they looked really, really good, I would say, overall this week. I was really impressed with CLG, and they're definitely going to be a team that is on the fringe of playoffs, but that means our biggest followers, Immortals dropping down to number 9. They probably should have been there all along, but CLG was really rough, and they lost to Immortals, so wanted to give them their credit for that. But TL finally dropping out of the top 6. It feels like it's been a long time coming. I've been holding out hope. They've been at number 5 in my power rankings basically all year because I just couldn't figure out a team that I truly believed was better than them. But then I saw this week and I'm like, man, this team's just not good, and it's frustrating to watch, but for now, I think they're going to be at number 8. Could they jump back up into the top 6 if everything starts going right, if Yan gets back on track, if Summon and Pioshik aren't complete disasters? Absolutely they can, but after this week, I just cannot justify having them above TSM and CLG, who both looked a lot better. If you wanted to have them at number 7, perhaps, above CLG, maybe I understand that, because CLG's just been very inconsistent, but I just don't think there's any world in which you can continuously put them into the top 6 right now. But those are my power ranking changes. It's time to move on to my player of the week and my dud of the week. My player of the week, no surprise. I mean, it's the broadcast player of the week. It's everybody's player of the week. It was Stixay on Golden Guardians. He was just so simply phenomenal this week. Golden Guardians itself was so good, but Stixay was the superstar of Golden Guardians, whether you want to say that or not. I know everybody wants to point at Gory and River as being the best players on the team, but Stixay had to be the one to take advantage of the resources that the team was able to generate, and man, did he take advantage. He was the best player in LCS this week, and it wasn't particularly close. My dud of the week, unfortunately, is going to go to Harry on Team Liquid. He just was not very good in the mid lane. Those 2 Azir games definitely stand out as just being incredibly poor. Obviously, Team Liquid has a lot of issues at their disposal right now, but Harry's the first one that comes to mind with just how he has been playing recently. A very bad Super Week for him. He has the talent to bounce back. Hopefully, he'll be able to do that. So, Harry's going to be my Week 4 dud of the week, and Stixay is going to be my Week 4 player of the week. But that's going to do it for the video. I hope you guys enjoyed. Of course, if you did, let me know down in the comments section below. Let me know who I'm rating too high, who I'm rating too low. I know you guys' opinions aren't going to perfectly match up with mine, and I'd love to have that discussion, of course, as long as it's civil down in the comment section. Of course, if you enjoyed the video, if you made it this far, an hour and a half into Super Week, hit that like button. It really does mean a lot for me and for the channel. It helps this get out to a lot more people, and that really means a lot to me because I put a lot of time and effort into these videos, and I really do hope you guys are enjoying them. Of course, if you are new here, hit that subscribe button. I post videos not only on the LCS, but on all 4 major regions, as well as the NACL, weekly videos on all of them. So if you're excited for that kind of content, if you just want a full LoL esports overview basically every single day, hit that subscribe button and I'll be there for you. But of course, with all that being said, I hope you are having a great day. I hope you continue to have a great day, and I will see you all later.